The throne room of the HFY flagship Luminara was a cathedral of living light, and on any other day, Queen Salith Vaughn would have found peace in its glow. But not today. Today the light felt cold. She stood at the center of the command dais, her tall bioluminescent form flickering with shades of deep violet that her crew knew meant grief, and she stared at the holographic display that floated before her, like a wound torn open in the air. 2 colonies gone. The names scrawled across the display in soft blue text, Verath Prime and the Shimmering Hold, and beside each name was a single word that made her stomach turn. Destroyed. Not conquered, not occupied, not besieged. Destroyed, as in burned to nothing, as in turned to ash and silence, as in every man and woman and child who had lived there was now gone forever. Krasovex the Unbound had done this. He had once been a general of the Drakari Imperium, species in the galaxy, and he had served his throne with brutal loyalty for decades. But something had broken inside him, or perhaps something had finally been set free, and 6 months ago he had stolen an armada of 400 warships and declared himself sovereign over nothing and everything at once. He called it a war without accord. In the galaxy governed by the Concord of 12 Thrones, war had rules, war had rituals, war had boundaries that every civilized species respected. But Krasovex had thrown all of that away like it meant nothing, because to him it did mean nothing. And now he was coming for the Aethari homeworld, hidden deep inside the sacred veil of Serath Nebula. Salith turned to her council. 12 advisors stood in a half-circle behind her, each one glowing with the pale blue of anxiety, and she could see the fear in their wide silver eyes, even though none of them would dare speak it aloud. "What is the status of our defense fleet?" asked, and her voice was steady, even though her hearts were not. Admiral Thyssen stepped forward, a tall and weathered Aethari, whose light had long ago dimmed to a permanent gray, and he bowed before speaking. "Your Majesty, we have 180 combat-ready vessels, 60 support ships, and approximately 40,000 trained soldiers. But I must be honest with you, my queen. Our forces have not fought a real war in over 300 years, and our ships are built for patrol and ceremony, not for the kind of slaughter that Krasovex brings." The room went quiet. Salith closed her eyes and let the weight of that truth settle on her shoulders like a stone, because she had known this already. She had known it from the moment the first distress signal came screaming out of Verath Prime. But hearing it spoken aloud made it real in a way she could not deny. "Then we must ask the Concord for help," she said. And so she did. Requests to all 12 thrones, to the Drakari Imperium, who disowned Krasovex, but refused to hunt him, to the Velesi Communion, whose psychic fleets could have ended the war in days, to the Orundai Collective, whose shipyards produced more warships in a month than the Aethari had in total, and to every other throne that had ever called the Aethari friend and ally. The responses came back within hours, and every single one of them broke her heart. The Drakari expressed regret, but stated that pursuing a rogue element outside their borders would set a dangerous precedent. The Velesi offered spiritual counsel and a team of grief therapists. The Orundai sent a formal note of sympathy and a shipment of emergency rations. The others offered variations of the same: words without weight, gestures without teeth, kindness without courage. And Salith stood in her throne room, reading each response with a face that showed nothing, while inside, she screamed. "They will let us die," she whispered, and the words tasted like poison on her tongue. First Voice Doranai, her oldest and most trusted advisor, stepped close to her then. He was ancient by Aethari standards, his glow reduced to a faint silver shimmer, but his mind was still the sharpest blade on the ship, and when he spoke, the entire council listened. "There is one more option, Your Majesty," he said quietly, "though I confess it frightens me to suggest it. Salith looked at him and waited. "Earth," he said. The word dropped into the room like a stone into still water, and the ripples of unease that spread through the council were immediate and visible. Their lights flickered, their postures stiffened, and Admiral Thyssen actually took a step backward, as if the word itself might bite him. Earth was the death world. Everyone in the galaxy knew about Earth, even though almost no one had been there. It was a small, rocky planet, orbiting an unremarkable yellow star on the very edge of map space, and it was home to a species called humans, who had been discovered roughly 40 years ago during a routine survey mission. The survey team had spent 3 days on the planet, and had come back changed. Their report had been classified at the highest level, but rumors spread like fire through the Concord. Rumors about a world where the ground shook and split open, where the sky hurled bolts of energy at the surface, where the water could freeze or boil or rise up in spinning columns of destruction, and where every single living creature was engaged in a constant and merciless war for survival against every other living creature. And the humans were the winners of that war. They were small and soft and fragile compared to most galactic species, but they had clawed their way to the top of their planet's food chain through sheer stubbornness and an almost disturbing willingness to adapt, to fight, and to keep fighting, long after any rational creature would have surrendered. The Concord had taken one look at the assessment report and decided unanimously to quarantine Earth behind a diplomatic cordon. No contact, no trade, no seats at the table, because the humans had not yet developed faster-than-light travel on their own, and the 12 Thrones agreed that giving them access to the stars would be like handing a loaded weapon to a child who had already burned down its own house several times. But that was 40 years ago, and Dora and I had heard whispers that the humans had advanced far beyond what anyone expected, that they had reverse-engineered fragments of alien technology found drifting near their system, that they had built their own ships, their own weapons, their own military, and that they were waiting, quietly and patiently, for someone to open the door. The humans are outside the Concord, Dora and I continued carefully. They are bound by no accords, no treaties, no rules of engagement, and every intelligence report I have ever read about them suggests that they are very, very good at war, because they have been practicing on each other since before they learned to write. "You are asking me to invite monsters into my home," Salith said. "I am asking you to choose between possible monsters and certain death, Your Majesty." The silence that followed was the loudest thing anyone in that room had ever heard. Salith looked at the holographic display one more time, at the names of her dead colonies, at the projected path of Krasavex's armada, at the blinking red indicators that showed her own fleet's pathetic chances of survival, and she made her decision. "Send the message," she said. "Send it through every back channel we have, and make it clear that we are not asking for diplomacy or negotiation. We are asking for help, the kind of help that comes with teeth." Room, and within the hour a coded transmission was streaking across the galaxy toward a small blue planet that most species preferred to pretend did not exist. The message was simple and desperate and honest, and it asked only one question: will you help us? On Earth, deep inside a mountain bunker carved into rock that was older than most civilizations in the galaxy, a woman named General Mara Chen sat at a steel desk, surrounded by screens and coffee cups and the quiet hum of machines that never slept. A young officer placed the decoded transmission in front of her, and she read it twice, then a third time, and then she leaned back in her chair and looked up at the ceiling with an expression that was impossible to read. "Get me the Defense Council," she said, and then she smiled, a small and dangerous and deeply human smile that would have made every species in the galaxy very nervous if they had seen it. The Athari sensor officer was the first to see it, and what he saw made his bioluminescence drain to white. A single ship had dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of Athari space, and it sat there in the darkness like something that had been born from it, matte black, angular, and covered in flat surfaces that seemed to swallow light rather than reflect it, as if the ship itself refused to be fully seen. It did not look like anything the galaxy had ever built. Galactic warships were elegant, curved hulls, luminous drives, aesthetic lines that spoke of the civilization that had crafted them. But this thing looked like it had been designed by engineers who did not care about beauty, and cared very much about one single purpose. And that purpose was clearly not peaceful. "One ship," Admiral Thyssen said from the bridge of the Luminara, and his voice carried a mixture of confusion and something dangerously close to insult. "We asked them for help, and they sent one ship." Queen Salith said nothing, because she had learned long ago that silence was wiser than assumptions. And she watched as the vessel began its approach, slow and deliberate, making no attempt to hail them, broadcasting no identification, just moving forward like a predator that had already decided it was not afraid of anything in this part of space. "The ship is identifying itself now," the sensor officer announced, and his voice had gone very quiet. "It calls itself the UTS Revenant. It is a Terran warship, Your Majesty." "Revenant," First Voice Dorane murmured from his place beside the Queen. In human language, that word means something that returns from the dead. Salith felt a chill pass through her that had nothing to do with the temperature. The Revenant docked with the Luminara 40 minutes later, and the moment the airlock seals engaged, everything changed. The air that leaked through smelled different, metallic and sharp, carrying scents that no Aetheri had ever encountered. And the sounds that came from the other side of the docking corridor were strange and unsettling in ways that were hard to name. Then the humans came through. Commander Rhea Vasquez walked at the front of her team, and she was not what Salith had expected. She was shorter than every Aetheri on the ship by at least a full head. Her skin was brown and weathered by what must have been years of hard use. Her dark hair was pulled back tight against her skull, and her eyes moved across the docking bay with a speed and precision that made the Aetheri guards instinctively tighten their grips on their ceremonial staffs. Behind her came a dozen more humans in dark gray armor that looked heavy and functional, and completely without decoration. And they moved through the space in a way that made the Aetheri deeply uncomfortable. They were quiet, far too quiet for creatures their size, and their heads turned constantly, scanning corners and exits and ceiling spaces as if they expected an attack at any moment, even though they were aboard an allied vessel. One of the Aetheri guards later told his friend that watching the humans enter the ship felt like watching water pour into a room. They filled every space, noticed every gap, and flowed around obstacles with a kind of fluid awareness that did not seem natural for solid beings. Sergeant Major Osei Ajay walked 2 steps behind Vasquez, and he was something else entirely, a massive human by their species standards, with dark skin and shoulders that looked like they had been carved from stone. And he carried himself with the quiet patience of someone who had seen terrible things and had made peace with all of them. He was smiling, but the smile did not reach his eyes, and the Aetheri who saw it agreed later that it was the kind of smile that meant he was comfortable in dangerous places, which was not a comforting thought at. Vasquez stopped in front of Queen Salith and looked up at her. The Queen towered over the human commander by nearly 2 feet, and there was a moment where the entire docking bay held its breath, waiting for the formal greetings and diplomatic rituals that the Aetheri considered sacred. "Commander Rhea Vasquez, United Terran Defense Council," the human said, and her voice was calm and even, and carried no ceremony whatsoever. "We got your message. We are here to help, and I would like to start immediately if that is acceptable to you, Your Majesty. No bowing, no honorific chains, no ritual exchange of light gifts, just a straight line from introduction to intent." And the Aetheri council members standing behind their queen exchanged glances that glowed with shades of orange discomfort. But Salith, to her credit, simply nodded. "You brought one ship," she said, and she could not keep the question out of her voice. "One ship is what you need right now," Vasquez replied. "We brought 300 personnel, Marines, engineers, electronic warfare specialists, medical staff, drone operators, and a few others whose job descriptions are complicated." 300, Admiral Thyssen repeated, and he did not bother hiding his doubt. "Commander, Krasovex has 400 warships and tens of thousands of warriors, and you brought 300 soldiers on one ship." Vasquez looked at the Admiral the way a teacher might look at a student who had asked a question that revealed exactly how much he did not understand. "Admiral, with respect, numbers are not the only thing that wins a war." Thyssen opened his mouth to respond, but Sergeant Major Ajay shifted his weight behind Vasquez. Just a small movement, barely noticeable, and something about the way the massive human repositioned himself made the Admiral decide that this was not an argument worth having right now. They moved to the war room. Beautiful space by Athari standards. Curved walls of living crystal that pulsed with soft light. Holographic projectors that could render entire star systems in perfect detail. And a central planning table made from a single piece of nebula-forged glass that had taken artisans 50 years to shape. Vasquez walked in, looked around once, and said, "This will work," in a tone that suggested she had worked in far worse conditions and was not impressed by far better ones. Admiral Thyssen presented the Athari defense plan, and it was, by galactic standards, a masterwork. A symmetrical formation of 180 warships arranged in concentric rings around the Veil of Serath, with support vessels positioned at mathematically perfect intervals, creating a layered shield that would force any attacker to fight through multiple defensive lines before reaching the homeworld. The hologram shimmered with elegant blue light, and the Athari commanders stood a little straighter. Straighter as it was displayed, because it represented 300 years of theoretical refinement, and it was the finest defensive formation their civilization had ever produced. Vasquez studied it for about 10 seconds. Then she looked at Thyssen and said, with a gentleness that somehow made it worse, "Admiral, this is a gorgeous way to die. May I suggest an alternative?" The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. Thyssen's glow shifted to a deep and angry red. But before he could speak, Vasquez had already moved to the holographic display and begun manipulating it with a confidence that suggested she had been studying Athari technology during the trip and had already figured out how it worked. "Your plan assumes that Krasovex will attack the way civilized species attack. Head-on, in formation, respecting the geometry of your defense," she said. "But Krasovex has already proven he does not follow the rules. Which means your beautiful formation is a trap, not for him, but for you, because he will not walk into it. He will go around it or through it at a point you did not expect, and your rigid structure will collapse, because it was never designed to adapt." She pulled the Athari formation apart with her fingers, and began rearranging ships into clusters that seemed random and chaotic to every alien watching. "Where we come from, we have a saying, 'No plan survives first contact with the enemy,'" Vasquez continued. "So instead of building one perfect plan that breaks the moment something unexpected happens, we build a framework that can change shape in real time based on what the enemy actually does." "That is not strategy," Thyssen said stiffly. "That is chaos." "Yes," Vasquez said, and she smiled for the first time, a quick, sharp expression that flashed across her face like lightning. "That is exactly what it is, and chaos is something humans understand better than anyone in this galaxy. Have been swimming in it since we crawled out of the oceans of our homeworld." She turned to Queen Salith directly. "Your Majesty, I need 3 things from you. First, I need your Admiral to trust me even when what I ask sounds insane. Second, I need access to your sensor networks and communication arrays. And third, I need you to understand that the way we fight is not going to look like anything your people have ever seen, and some of it will be ugly, and some of it will make your stomach turn. But I promise you this, your people will survive, and Krasovex will not. Salith looked into the human's eyes, those strange, small, impossibly intense human eyes that seemed to burn with a fire that had no bioluminescent source. And she saw something there that she had not seen in any of the Concord's polite responses. She saw certainty. "You have what you need, Commander," the Queen said. Vasquez nodded once and turned to her team, and within minutes, War Room was transformed. Cables snaking across the crystal floor, portable screens propped against sacred walls, a machine that apparently did nothing but produce a hot brown liquid that the humans consumed in alarming quantities, and a dog-eared paper map that Ajay pinned to a pillar of living crystal with adhesive strips that definitely left marks. First voice, Doranai stood beside his queen and watched the humans work. Watched them argue with each other in fast bursts of a language that sounded like controlled explosions. Watched them laugh at things that were clearly not funny. Watched one of them pull a small knitted object from a pocket and begin working on it with tiny needles while simultaneously reading tactical data on a screen. "My queen," he said very quietly, so that only she could hear. "What have we invited aboard?" Salith watched Commander Vasquez pin a photograph of Krasovex to the wall and draw a red circle around his face with a marking tool. And she answered honestly, "I do not know, Doranai, but whatever they are ours now, and the galaxy is about to find out what that means." Krasovex the Unbound stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Devourer of Thrones, and he looked out at the stars with the satisfied calm of a predator who had already decided that everything he could see belonged to him. He was enormous, even by Drakari standards, 9 feet of scaled muscle and armored bone, with eyes like molten copper, and a jaw lined with teeth that his species had never evolved past because they had never needed to, and when he spoke, his voice rolled through the bridge like distant thunder. "How long until we reach the Veil?" he asked. His navigation officer checked the display and answered quickly, because slow answers made Krasovex impatient, and impatient Krasovex had once thrown a lieutenant through a bulkhead door. 14 hours, my lord. The Vanguard fleet of 200 ships is already in position to begin the approach run." Krasovex smiled, which was a terrible thing to witness. He had burned Verath Prime because it was easy, and he had destroyed the shimmering hold because it was fun, and now he was going to crack open the Veil of Sereth and reduce the Aethari homeworld to glass, because no one in the galaxy had the courage to stop him. Not the Concord, not the other thrones, not anyone. Or so he believed. 700 light-minutes ahead of Krasovex's Vanguard, in the dark space between stars where no one was supposed to be, Commander Rhea Vasquez sat in the command chair of the UTS Revenant and drank coffee from a metal cup that had a dent in it, shaped like a small fist. "Status," she said. Lieutenant Park, her sensor officer, pulled up the display without looking away from his screens, because Park never looked away from his screens, and everyone had stopped expecting him to. "Vanguard fleet is on approach. 206 warships in standard Drakari assault formation. Tight diamond clusters, heavy shields forward, weapons hot. Prepared corridor in approximately 47 minutes. And they have no idea we are here?" Vasquez asked. Park allowed himself a small and very smug smile. "Commander, they have no idea anything is here. The sensor ghosts we deployed are feeding their scanners a picture of empty space so convincing that I almost believe it myself." Vasquez nodded and opened a channel to the entire expeditionary force. "All units, this is Vasquez. The guests are arriving in less than an hour, and I want everything ready. Minefield teams confirm activation. Boarding squads suit up. PsyOps get your broadcast loaded. And someone please tell Corporal Reeves to stop knitting and get to his station." A voice came back over the channel almost immediately. "Corporal Reeves here, Commander. I can knit and kill at the same time. It is called multitasking." Laughter rippled through the comms, and Vasquez did not stop it, because she knew that humans who laughed before a war were humans who would fight well. On the Athari flagship, Queen Salith and her entire command staff watched the same sensor data on their holographic displays, and the mood could not have been more different. The Athari were terrified, their bioluminescence cycling through shades of white and pale yellow that signaled deep distress. And Admiral Fyson stood rigid, with his hands clasped behind his back so tightly that his fingers had gone dark. "They are really going to do this," he said, and it was not clear whether he meant it as a statement of awe or disbelief. First Voice Doranai watched the human tactical overlay that had been projected alongside the Athari displays, and he shook his head slowly, because what he saw there looked nothing like any battle plan he had ever studied. It looked like a web spun by something patient and hungry, and the Drakari vanguard was flying straight into its center. The first Drakari ship dropped out of faster-than-light travel and immediately exploded. It did not explode because it had been shot. It exploded because it had materialized directly on top of a cluster of autonomous micromines that the humans had seeded across the exit corridor 3 days earlier. Tiny devices no bigger than a clenched fist that carried enough focused energy to punch through heavy armor at point-blank range. The second ship emerged 2 seconds later and hit another cluster, and then the third, and then the fourth, and within 30 seconds, the approach corridor was filled with fire and debris and screaming transmissions from Drakari captains, who had gone from confident to panicked in the time it took to draw a single breath. But the mines were only the beginning. As the Vanguard fleet scrambled to regroup, their communication systems went dead, not jammed in the traditional sense, but flooded with so much false data and corrupted signal traffic that every ship was suddenly alone, unable to talk to the ship next to it, unable to coordinate, unable to do anything except react to the chaos that was eating them alive. Lieutenant Park had spent 4 days studying Drakari encryption protocols and had cracked them in 2, and now every enemy communication channel was a weapon being used against its owners. "Signal ghosts are live," Park reported. "They are seeing phantom fleets on every scanner. I am giving them 300 contacts that do not exist, coming from 6 different directions." On the Drakari ships, panic was spreading like a disease. Officers screamed orders that no one could hear. Gunners fired at targets that were not there, and captains made desperate maneuvers to avoid collisions with Allied vessels that were just as blind and just as afraid. And then the boarding teams arrived. 12 humans in EVA suits, just 12, launched from hidden positions on asteroids that the Drakari had dismissed as debris, crossed the gap between the rocks and the enemy capital ships in absolute silence, using compressed gas thrusters that produce no heat signature and no engine trail. Sergeant Major Ajay led the first team personally. They landed on the hull of a Drakari battlecruiser, cut through the outer plating with plasma torches in under 90 seconds, entered the ship through a maintenance corridor that the Drakari had not bothered to guard, because no species in the history of the galaxy had ever been insane enough to board an active warship during combat, and moved through the interior like ghosts made of violence. They did not try to capture the ship. They went straight to the engine room, planted shaped charges on the main drive couplings, went to the bridge access corridor, and welded every door shut with portable fusion torches. And then they left, back out through the hull breach, back across the void, gone before anyone on board even understood what had happened. And battlecruiser's engines died, and it began to drift. A massive armored hulk that was now nothing but an obstacle blocking the firing lanes of every ship behind it. Ajay's team did the same thing to 2 more capital ships in under 20 minutes. On the bridge of the Luminara, the Athari watched all of this in complete and utter silence. Not the comfortable silence of calm, but the stunned silence of creatures who were seeing something that fundamentally challenged their understanding of what was possible. They boarded active warships during combat, Admiral Thyssen whispered, and his light had gone completely gray. They walked through space in nothing but suits, and they boarded enemy vessels, and they disabled them by hand. Who does that? Who in this galaxy does that? Humans, Dorine answered softly. Humans do that. Far away, in a neutral space station at the edge of the conflict zone, a Concord intelligence observer named Jevrin Tull sat in a darkened room and watched the same battle through a network of hidden sensors that the Concord maintained throughout the galaxy for exactly this kind of situation. Jevrin was a Valesi, a slender psychic species known for their emotional control and analytical minds, and he had been assigned to monitor the human involvement with strict orders to report everything he saw. He was currently on his 4th report in 2 hours, and his hands were shaking. The humans do not fight wars as we understand the concept, he dictated into his recording device. They do not engage in battle. They dismantle opponents. They treat military conflict as an engineering problem to be solved through the most efficient combination of deception and precision violence. And they do so with a casualness that I find deeply and profoundly disturbing. He paused and added, I recommend immediate and comprehensive reassessment of the Terran threat classification. Our current rating of them as a pre-ascension quarantine species is not merely inaccurate. It is dangerously and possibly fatally wrong. Back in the killing field, the PsyOps team activated their final weapon. Corporal Reeves, who had indeed finished his knitting, sat at a console aboard the Revenant and began broadcasting on Krasavex's personal command frequency. And the voice that came through the Drakari speakers was Krasavex's own voice, perfectly synthesized by an AI that had learned to replicate it from intercepted communications. False orders poured through the fleet. Retreat commands, ambush warnings, reports of mutiny on ships that were perfectly loyal, and the already fractured vanguard began to tear itself apart from the inside as captains who could not verify anything turned on each other out of paranoia and fear. In 3 hours, 141 ships of the 206-ship vanguard were destroyed, disabled, or had surrendered. Humans had not lost a single vessel. Not one. Krasavex received the report aboard the Devourer of Thrones, and for the first time in his long and bloody career, he felt something he did not recognize. It sat in his chest like a cold stone, and it took him several minutes to identify it, because he had so little experience with the emotion. It was doubt. And then his personal communicator activated, and a human voice came through. Not his own voice this time, but a woman's voice, calm and clear, and completely without fear. Warlord Krasavex, this is Commander Vasquez of the United Terran Defense Council. You have lost 41 ships, and we have not lost one, and I want you to understand that this is us being polite. Would you like to see what happens when we stop? Krasavex crushed the communicator in his fist and roared an order that shook the walls at his bridge. Bring me everything, every ship, every soldier, every weapon we have. Burn these humans out of my sky, if it is the last thing I do. And somewhere in the darkness of space, aboard a matte black ship that smelled like coffee and adrenaline, Rhea Vasquez heard that roar through an intercepted channel and turned to Sergeant Major Agi with a look that was almost sad. He chose the hard way, she said. Agi checked his weapon and shrugged. They always do. Krasavex brought everything. 812 warships tore through the darkness toward the Vale of Seraph in a formation that was less a fleet and more a fist. A massive, brutal, overwhelming wall of metal and fire, driven by the rage of a warlord who had never been humiliated before, and who had decided that the only acceptable response was to burn everything in his path until the humiliation stopped. On the bridge of the Luminara, Admiral Thyssen looked at the sensor display, and his light went out entirely. Not dimmed, not flickered, but simply stopped glowing, which for an Athari was the equivalent of a human going pale enough to faint. 800 ships, he said, and his voice sounded like it was coming from very far away. Commander Vasquez, I hope you have a miracle hidden somewhere aboard that black ship of yours, because what I see on that screen is the end of my civilization. Vasquez stood beside him, and she was doing something that baffled every Athari on the bridge. She was eating a ration bar, slowly and methodically, as if the approaching apocalypse was mildly inconvenient, but not worth skipping a meal over. Admiral, she said between bites, I need you to trust me for about the next 6 hours, and I need you to understand that what you are about to see is going to look like madness, right up until the moment it starts looking like victory. She finished the ration bar, folded the wrapper neatly into her pocket, and activated her communicator. Revenant, this is Vasquez. Activate the beacon. Deep inside the UTS Revenant, in a compartment that even the Athari had not been allowed to see, a device the size of a human coffin hummed to life. It was a subspace relay beacon, a piece of technology that Earth had not shared with anyone, and when it activated, it tore a pinpoint corridor through the fabric of space itself. The corridor opened, and through it came the rest. Terran warships dropped out of the breach, one after another, each one matte black and angular like the Revenant, each one bristling with weapons that the Athari sensors could not fully identify, and each one carrying its own full complement of soldiers and enough ordnance to crack the crust of a small moon. The Athari bridge crew stared at the new arrivals, and someone, no one would ever admit who, made a sound that was half gasp and half prayer. You had reinforcements this entire time, Thyssen said, and his voice carried a note of something that might have been anger or might have been awe. I had contingencies, Vasquez corrected him. There is a difference. Reinforcements are what you call for when things go wrong. Contingencies are what you prepare because you know things will go wrong. And the difference between the two is the difference between hoping and planning. She did not wait for a response. All Terran vessels, this is Vasquez. Execute. Phase 2. Wolfpack Protocol. Rules of engagement are as follows. Isolate, disable, offer surrender, and if surrender is refused, then remove the problem permanently. I want fire discipline, and I want precision. We are not here to commit a massacre. We are here to end a war. The 13 Terran ships split apart, like a pack of wolves breaking formation to surround prey. Each ship peeled away in a different direction, moving with a speed and agility that should not have been possible for vessels of their size. And they dove into the approaching Drakari armada, not as a wall meeting a wall, but as blades sliding between ribs. The wolfpacks hit the flanks first. Each Terran ship targeted the communication relays between clusters of enemy vessels, cutting them off from the main fleet, the way a predator separates the weak from the herd. And within minutes, Krasavex's mighty armada of 800 warships was no longer one army, but dozens of confused and isolated groups, each one suddenly alone in the dark, with something fast and lethal circling just outside their sensor range. And then the offers came. Every isolated cluster received the same transmission, broadcast in perfect Drakari on every open channel. This is the United Terran Defense Council. You are cut off from your fleet and surrounded. Power down your weapons, and you will be treated with dignity. Continue fighting, and you will be destroyed. You have 60 seconds to decide. Some surrendered immediately. Captains who had joined Krasavex out of fear rather than loyalty, and who saw this moment as their exit. They powered down their shields and waited with the desperate relief of creatures who had just been offered a door out of a burning room. Others fought, and those fights were short and brutal and one-sided in a way that made the watching Athari feel something close to pity for the Drakari, because the humans did not fight fair, and they absolutely did not fight the way the galaxy expected. They used electronic warfare to blind their targets, drone swarms to overwhelm point defenses, and precision strikes that disabled engines and weapons while leaving life support intact. because Vasquez had meant what she said about not committing a massacre. But the real battle was happening on Krasavex's flagship. Sergeant Major Osei Ajay stood in the airlock of a boarding shuttle, with 24 Marines behind him, and he was checking his weapon with the calm focus of a man who had done this exact thing so many times that it had become as routine as brushing his teeth. "Listen up," he said, and his deep voice filled the shuttle like warm concrete. "The Devourer of Thrones is a Drakari heavy command vessel, which means tight corridors, low ceilings for us, but perfect for them, and a crew of approximately 2,000 very large and very angry lizards who would like nothing more than to tear us apart. So, stay tight, stay smart, move fast, and remember your training." He paused and added, "Also, the artificial gravity on Drakari ships runs about 1.3 times Earth standard, so your knees are going to hate you tomorrow. You are welcome to complain about it after we win." The shuttle hit the flagship's hull like a hammer driving a nail, and the breaching charge blew a hole through 3 layers of armor plating in under 2 seconds, and then the Marines poured through. The interior of the Devourer of Thrones was a nightmare of red emergency lighting and blaring alarms and the thunder of Drakari boots as warriors scrambled to meet the intruders. And the first clash happened in a corridor junction barely wide enough for 4 humans to stand abreast. A Drakari warrior came around the corner at full charge, 8 feet tall, 300 pounds of scaled muscle, carrying a plasma axe that could cut through starship plating, and he swung at the lead Marine with enough force to split a ground vehicle in half. The Marine ducked under the swing, fired 2 shots into the warrior's knee joint where the armor was weakest, and rolled sideways as the massive body crashed to the floor. 2 more Marines stepped over the fallen Drakari without breaking stride, zip-tying his wrists as they passed, with a speed that suggested they had practiced this on something just as large and just as angry. The humans moved through the ship like water through cracks. Flashbangs first, then entry, then controlled bursts of fire aimed at joints and weapon hands rather than center mass. Because Ajay had ordered minimum lethality where possible, and his Marines followed that order even when it made their jobs harder. They fought through 6 decks in 40 minutes, and when they reached the bridge corridor, they found Krasavex himself waiting for them. He stood alone in the center of the corridor, his ceremonial warblade drawn, copper eyes burning with a fury that had eaten through his reason and left nothing but the animal underneath. He was the last obstacle between the humans and the end of this war, and he intended to make that obstacle count. "Come then, little creatures," he growled, and his voice shook dust from the ceiling. "Come and see what a true warrior looks like." Ajay stepped forward, handed his rifle to the Marine beside him, and rolled his shoulders once. "After you," he said. Krasavex lunged, a strike that was faster than anything that size should have been able to produce, the warblade cutting a silver arc through the air that would have separated Ajay's head from his body if it had connected. It did not connect. Ajay stepped inside the arc of the swing, caught the warlord's weapon arm at the wrist, twisted his body with a leverage technique that used Krasavex's own momentum against him, and snapped the wrist sideways with a sound like a branch. Breaking. The warblade clattered to the floor, and before Krasavex could roar, Ajay had swept his legs, put him face down on the deck plating, and zip-tied his wrists behind his back in 4 seconds flat. "You have the right to remain alive," Ajay said, breathing only slightly harder than normal. "I suggest you exercise it." Krasavex lay on the cold metal floor of his own bridge corridor, bound by strips of plastic that a child could have carried, defeated by a creature half his size in less time than it took to draw a full breath. And the sound he made was not a roar or a curse, but something quieter and worse. It was the sound of something inside him finally and completely breaking. The war was over, and then came the part that terrified the galaxy more than anything else. Within an hour of the last shot being fired, the humans shifted, not gradually, not reluctantly, but instantly and completely, as if someone had flipped a switch inside all 300 of them at once. Marines who had been breaching doors and clearing corridors with lethal precision 20 minutes earlier were now carrying medical supplies into the holds where wounded Drakari prisoners sat bleeding and afraid. And they were gentle. Not performing gentleness, not pretending, but genuinely and unmistakably gentle, in a way that made no sense to anyone watching. A human medic named Corporal Diane Okafor knelt beside a Drakari warrior whose arm had been shattered by a breaching charge, and she set the broken bones and applied a splint and spoke to him in soft tones while she worked. And when the warrior looked at her with confusion and asked why she was helping him, she said, "Because you are hurt, and I am a medic, and that is all that matters right now." Queen Salith walked through the aftermath aboard the Devourer of Thrones and saw humans feeding prisoners, treating wounds, covering the dead with blankets, with a respect that the officers clearly did not expect and did not know how to process. She found Vasquez standing in a corridor, watching Corporal Okafor work on her third patient, and the commander's face held an expression that Salith had not seen before. It was tired, and sad, and proud, all at the same time. "How do your people carry so much wrath and so much mercy in the same heart?" Salith asked. And it was not a diplomatic question, but a real one, born from genuine and bewildered wonder. Vasquez was quiet for a moment, watching her medic ease the pain of an enemy soldier who had been trying to kill them all just an hour ago. "Practice, Your Majesty," she said. "A lot of practice." The Concord of 12 Thrones had not called an emergency session in over 200 years. And the last time it had happened, a star had exploded and consumed an entire inhabited system. But what the 12 monarchs were looking at now frightened them more than any dying star ever could. They sat in the great chamber of accord on the neutral station of Paraxis Prime, each monarch surrounded by advisors and military commanders, each one glowing or bristling or shifting with the physical tells of their species' version of deep unease. And at the center of the chamber, a holographic display played the combat footage that Concord intelligence observer Jevrin Tal had transmitted over the past 72 hours. They watched in silence. They watched humans in EVA suits board active warships with nothing but plasma torches and audacity. They watched a single Terran ship cut through a formation of 40 Drakari cruisers like a blade through silk. They watched Major Ajay put a 9-foot warlord on the ground in 4 seconds, and they watched a human medic set the broken arm of an enemy soldier with hands that were still bruised from the fighting. No one spoke for a long time after the footage ended. Grand Sovereign Dreth of the Drakari Imperium was the first to break the silence, and his voice was rough with something that his species did not easily admit to feeling. "Krasovex was the finest warrior my Imperium has produced in 3 generations, he said. "He conquered 11 worlds for my throne before his madness took him, and he was defeated by a creature that weighs less than his armor. I do not know what to do with this information." "None of us do," said the Valesi Communion speaker, a willowy figure whose psychic aura was flickering with undisguised anxiety. "I have read Observer Tal's reports 4 times, and each time I understand them less. The humans fight with a brutality that rivals the Drakari, strategize with a complexity that rivals the Arundai, adapt with a speed that rivals no one, because no species in our records has ever demonstrated anything comparable. And then when the fighting stops, they heal their enemies and feed their prisoners, and one of them was making clothing with sticks and string during a combat operation." "Knitting," said the Arundai Collective Prime, who had apparently done research. "The activity is called knitting, and it is a stress management technique. They were so comfortable in combat that they needed a hobby to keep themselves from becoming bored." That statement landed on the chamber like a physical weight, and several monarchs shifted in their seats as the implications settled in. The Concord's chief military analyst, a Thesserai named Commander Vaughn, stepped forward and activated a new display, this one showing data that Concord intelligence had compiled on Earth over the past 40 years of observation. I must be direct with you, Vaughn said, and his usually steady voice carried a tremor that he could not quite control. What you witnessed in the Vale of Sereth was not a demonstration of human military capability. It was a minor deployment, a expeditionary company of 300 personnel, supported by 13 warships, operating under restrictive rules of engagement that prioritized minimum casualties on both sides. He paused to let that sink in before continuing. Earth's full military strength, based on our best intelligence estimates, includes a standing force of approximately 4.7 million active soldiers, a reserve force roughly 3 times that size, a naval fleet of over 800 warships with more being built every year, and a weapons development program that our analysts describe as, and I quote from the classified assessment, relentlessly innovative in ways that suggest the species treats the invention of new methods of destruction as a form of recreation. The silence in the chamber was so complete that the hum of the station's life support systems sounded like thunder. But that is not what concerns me most, Vaughn continued. What concerns me most is their history. The humans have been waging war against each other for their entire existence as a species. Thousands of years of continuous conflict against the most dangerous enemy they could possibly face, which is themselves. Every strategy they used against Krasaveks was not invented for him. It was invented for use against other humans, and merely adapted for alien physiology. Which means that what we saw was not their best work. It was their casual work, the equivalent of a master craftsman using beginner tools. Grand Sovereign Dreth leaned forward in his seat. What are you telling us, Commander? I am telling you, Your Majesty, that we quarantined the most dangerous species in the galaxy behind a diplomatic cordon, and then ignored them for 40 years, and in that time, they did not sit idle. They advanced, they built, they prepared, and they waited. And now someone has let them out, and the question before this Concord is not whether we should be afraid, but what we intend to do about the fact that we absolutely should be. The chamber erupted. Monarchs spoke over each other in a dozen languages. Advisors argued with commanders, and the ancient protocols of the Concord strained under the weight of fear that filled the room like smoke. Some voices called for an immediate military response, others demanded reinforcement of the quarantine, and still others insisted that the humans must be destroyed before they grew any stronger. It was into this chaos that Queen Salith Vaughn of the Aethari Dominion stood and raised her hand for silence. She was not the most powerful monarch in the chamber, and her species was not the most feared, but she had just survived a war that should have killed her. People, and she had done it with the help of the very species that this chamber was now discussing like a disease to be cured. And when she spoke, her bioluminescence burned with a fierce and steady gold that commanded attention from every eye in the room. I have listened to your fear, she said, and I understand it, because I felt it myself when the humans first came aboard my ship. I watched them move through my corridors like predators. I watched them tear apart my admiral's battle plans with 10 seconds of analysis. I watched them fight with a ferocity that made my warriors look like children playing at war. She paused and let her gaze move across every monarch in the chamber. But I also watched what they did after the fighting stopped. I watched a human medic set the broken bones of a Drakari warrior who had been trying to kill her minutes earlier. I watched human soldiers share their food with prisoners and cover the enemy dead with respect. Commander Vasquez, stand in a corridor full of blood and wreckage, and look sad. Not triumphant, not proud, but sad, because the violence was necessary, but she did not enjoy it. She stepped closer to the center of the chamber. You are afraid of what the humans can do, and you should be. But what you are failing to see is what the humans choose to do, and those are two very different things. They have the power to destroy, yes, more power than any of us understood, but they also have something that I have not seen in this chamber today, and that is the willingness to help someone who cannot help themselves, even when there is nothing to be gained from doing so. She looked directly at Grand Sovereign Dreth. I asked the Concord for help when Krasovex came for my people. I asked every one of you, and every one of you said no. You said it was complicated. You said it would set a precedent. You said you were sorry, but your hands were tied. Humans, a species you had locked behind a wall and forgotten about. And they said yes. They said it immediately. They sent their soldiers to die for a species they had never met, because it was the right thing to do. Her light burned brighter. So before you talk about quarantines and military responses and how to contain the human threat, I want every monarch in this room to sit with one simple truth. When my people were dying, the humans were the only ones in this galaxy who cared enough to help. And if that makes them dangerous, then perhaps the rest of us should ask ourselves what it means that we were not. The chamber went quiet in a way that was different from before. Not the silence of fear, but the silence of shame. Heavy and uncomfortable, and impossible to argue with. The vote that followed was not unanimous, but it did not need to be. By a margin of 8-4, the Concord of 12 Thrones voted to lift the quarantine on Earth, and to extend an invitation for formal diplomatic relations, not a throne, because a throne required centuries of integration and cultural exchange, but a chair, a provisional seat at the Concord table, with a voice and a vote, and the recognition that humanity was not a threat to be contained, but a neighbor to be known. The 4 who voted against did so quietly and without conviction, because Salith's words had done something that no military analysis could. They had made the fear feel small, and the shame feel large. 3 days later, Commander Ria Vasquez stood in the docking bay of the Luminara for the last time. Her pack slung over one shoulder, and her crew assembled behind her, in neat rows that somehow still managed to look slightly disorganized, in a way that was uniquely and irreversibly human. Queen Salith came to see her off personally, walking the length of the docking bay, with First Voice Dorane at her side, and a small crystal box held carefully in both. "Commander," she said, "before you leave, I want to give you something." She opened the box, and inside it lay a veil crystal, a fragment of the sacred nebula that housed the Aethari homeworld, pulsing with soft inner light like a captured star, the most precious artifact her civilization possessed. "This is a piece of our home," Salith said, "and I give it to you so that your people will always know they have a home among the stars, not because of what you did in battle, but because of what you did after." Vasquez looked at the crystal for a long moment, and something moved behind her eyes that the Aethari could not quite read, something old and tired, and grateful and human, in a way that no other species would ever fully understand. She took the crystal gently, held it up to the light, and watched the colors dance inside it. "We will take good care of it, Your Majesty," she said. And a small smile crossed her face. "That is kind of our thing. We break stuff, then we fix stuff. Usually in that order." Salith laughed, and it was the first time she had laughed since before the war, and the sound of it rang through the docking bay like music. Vasquez saluted, a crisp human gesture that meant respect in a way that needed no translation. And then she turned and walked back to her ship, and her crew followed, and the airlock sealed behind them, with a soft hiss that sounded like an ending and a beginning at the same time. The Revenant undocked, turned its dark hull toward open space, and accelerated away from the Luminara in a smooth and silent arc that carried it toward the distant light of a small yellow star that the galaxy had spent 40 years trying to forget about. On the observation deck, Salith and Dorane stood side by side and watched the human ship grow smaller against the stars. "The galaxy feared what Earth would send," Dorane said quietly. Salith watched the Revenant vanish into the darkness, and she thought about Vasquez eating a ration bar before a battle, about Ajay smiling before a fight, about Corporal Okafor setting the broken arm of an enemy, about Corporal Reeves knitting between acts of war, about 300 small and fragile and impossibly stubborn creatures who had crossed the galaxy to save a people they had never met, simply because someone had asked. They should fear them, she said softly, not because the humans are cruel, but because they choose not to be. And any species that powerful, that violent, that kind, is the most terrifying thing the universe has ever produced. Dora and I considered this for a moment, and then asked, "Do you think they will be good allies?" Salith smiled, and her light burned warm and golden and steady. "I think they will be the best allies this galaxy has ever known, and I think the galaxy does not deserve them yet, but I believe we can learn to." The stars shone cold and ancient, indifferent above them, the way stars always do. But somewhere among them a small black ship was carrying 300 humans home, and the galaxy would never be the same again. Not because humanity had arrived with fire and fury, but because they had arrived with fire and fury, and then, when the fire was no longer needed, they had put it away and offered a hand instead. And that, more than any weapon or warship or warrior, was what made them extraordinary.